Welcome to Ira's Everything Bagel, where I talk with intriguing people about everything. Their passions, pursuits, and points of view. A house catches fire in 2011. One box survives. Its contents becomes the catalyst for a quest whose seeds were planted in 1983, the day that Linda Ambrus Broenniman learned that her Catholic father was Jewish, and what little family history she knew was a lie. My guest today is Linda Ambrus Broenniman. She's author of the Politzer Saga. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all the usual places. For everything about Linda Ambrus Broenniman, go to PulitzerSaga.com. And Linda, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ira, for having me. It's a delight being here.
Well, I'm glad you came on because it was an interesting story of what started you on this quest that ends up taking you back 8 generations. That's quite a distance there.
Well, as you said in the intro, when I was 27, I learned that I thought my father was Catholic, and I learned that he was Jewish. So there was always something in sort of the back of my brain thinking, I've got to find the truth about my family. But then I was 27, you get involved in figuring out your career and family and growing up and becoming independent of your family. But there was always that thing in the back saying, I've got to learn about my family. And then, of course, the house fire, and with the box that was found, and it really is a miracle that it survived and then it was found. I decided, that was a sign. It was time for me to really find out the truth about my family. So I think that was the impetus.
And how did you start that quest? Was it research through Ancestry.com? Was it more looking at the books in the library? Was it talking to relatives, or was it a combination of all those?
Well, it was a great question. The problem was that most of the documents in the box, there were documents and letters and photographs, but all the documents and the letters were written in Hungarian. And I don't speak Hungarian, I don't read it, I don't write it, and it's a very, very difficult language. So I started trying to put things in Google Translate and Microsoft Translate, and they don't do very well with Hungarian. So
we're not quite there. That may have to wait for the 22nd century.
Exactly. So I knew I needed to find someone who could help me. And really, I think it was luck, but there was some guiding principle who was helping me find the right people at the right time. A friend of a friend introduced me to somebody who lived about a half an hour away up in Maryland. And she was Hungarian, she was Jewish, she was just this dynamo lady. And when she helped me and looked at the documents, she said, these are really important documents and they need to be researched properly. So she gave me a few names, and one of those names was Andras Gyekiczki, who was a Hungarian lawyer and sociologist. And eventually I ended up working with Andras for about 7 years, unfortunately, until his death.
Yeah, that's a long time. Was he based in the United States, or was he in Hungary?
No, he was in Budapest.
Okay.
So, yeah, so it was a long distance. It was a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of emails back and forth, and eventually, some trips back and forth
Right.
too. So yeah.
Could you imagine trying to do that before Zoom or even before email? That would have been fascinating.
Yeah, that would have been a lot more travel back and forth, I think.
With his help, were you surprised at what you found in terms of
I was
going back 8 generations?
It was, what was interesting is even before I started working with him, when we were exploring the relationship, he looked up a couple people, and he looked up my great-great-grandfather, who was his last name was actually Misner. And he said, oh my goodness, he found like 300 articles that either my great-grandfather had written or had been written about him. So he knew there was sort of a rich source of data there. But what we didn't realize, and in the box, there was a letter from my father's niece to my father about some books that had been written. And so Andras contacted her, and she had a copy of a book that was written by my great uncle, who he had died in 1920, but he wrote a book called Our Family History. And so it's that book that allowed us to go back to 8 generations. And yeah, it was a miracle one that book survived, and then that we found it. So
Well, Andras was able to get this material. How did he go about his end of the research? In other words, was he contacting people in Hungary, museums, schools, institutions? How did he find
all,
to go?
I will say all of the above.
Hmm.
He was a master sleuth, and he would start, I think he started with sort of birth and death and marriage records, which were more easily gotten, but he spent a lot of time. There's the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives, and they have these gigantic uh, books that go back, handwritten books that go back to centuries.
So it's the
And
old as the Torah, is what you're telling us.
yeah, yeah. So, he went back, and he would look at those, and he found donation records. He did just as you said, he found school records of my great grandfather and my great grandfather, their school records. It's a miracle what he found.
What was your relationship with him in this sense that why did he decide to work with you to find out this information about your family? It wasn't his family, and I'm sure he had other commitments, etc. What was the arrangement that, or what was the emotional connection that propelled him to help you with this quest?
That is such a great question. So I think there's a couple things. One, he was not Jewish, by the way, but he had an incredible affinity for the Jewish people, and actually had been requested to be buried in the Jewish cemetery in Budapest, which was something that they made an exception for, because he was just an exceptional person.
Mhm.
But there's a couple of things. One, he had done an exhibit called oh goodness, now I'm forgetting what it's called, Our Forgotten Neighbors. And it was about a small town where he grew up, the town of Papa, which is in eastern Hungary. And it was a small town, but basically it had 6,000 Jews, and almost all of them were wiped out in the Holocaust. So he had done an amazing exhibit, and then which also then got turned into a book about Our Forgotten Neighbors. And that had been done, it had been completed several years before. And the other thing, Andras he'd been very high up in government. He'd been chief of staff for the Minister of the Interior, and also chief of staff for the Budapest mayor, which is a very big position. And then he had been asked to go into the Orban government, and he refused. And so both he and his wife had been blackballed for 8 years. So I think by the time I came along, one, he had also been fighting colon cancer for a very long time. So the timing just worked out. But it was also a subject matter that was very dear to his heart, and that was trying to help people find their roots, especially their Jewish roots, and give tribute to all of those people who had been basically murdered in the Holocaust.
Was there one thing that you said to him or one thing he learned about you that sealed the deal, in the sense that your story about finding the box and that's why you came to him through a friend, or was it something else? What was it that?
Well, I think he really trusted this friend. He was very close to her. So I think that in itself built up some trust. But then when we started having conversations, I think there was just something, there was something so genuine and honest about him. And I think he felt the same thing about me, that what we were really trying to do is learn about these remarkable people. And yeah, I think we just sort of felt that.
When you were working with him, was it during that time that the idea for the book came about, or was it after you were
Well,
working with
that's
Andras?
another great question, because I never intended to write a book. But what would happen was he would find information. And I will say that my history was woefully inadequate. So as he would find information, I started doing a deep dive on history, reading as much history as I could, and other biographies from that era. So I needed a way to sort of organize and contain this information. And I just sort of found that the book emerged from that.
Interesting.
So yeah.
In a way, it was organic. You were just putting together a
Yeah.
way for you to understand your story and your family's story. What was,
Exactly.
what was the reaction of your family to all of this information and eventually the book? I'm sure you shared as you went through the process with him, finding out all this stuff. But what was the reaction of your nearest and dearest to all this information?
Well, I will say I'm one of six, one of seven. So I've got six siblings and I'm smack in the middle. I think, my older sister was right there with me the whole time and very excited about all the findings, and my younger sister was also. We actually didn't tell my brothers because we were very sensitive at the time. My father was still alive when we started the journey, and he was on in his years, and we really didn't want to upset him. So we kept it sort of quiet and didn't tell them until much later.
What was his reaction?
We never told my father.
Oh, I thought you said you waited until
Yeah,
then
we
told
never
him.
told my father. We told my brothers later
Okay,
on.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I suspect that you knew you were Jewish because even though you were raised Catholic, you had this affinity for bagels. And that was why you started this quest. That's my story for you, Eileen.
Absolutely. I've always loved bagels.
So when you started to see this information come in, and there's a lot of it, so you're the family expert now on that. How did you come up with the title, and why did you? I'll still go back to it. You said you weren't planning to write the book. It sort of emerged organically, which I understand totally, but you still have to then put it together as a book and get it out there as well. So there must have been some point along the way that you said, you know what, this has a feel of a book. I want to get the story out, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. What was the main
Yeah,
reason for you
I
to put
think
the
as
book
I
out?
started writing and I started putting it together, I started sharing it with a very close friend of mine. So this friend had been a friend since business school, since when I first learned that I was Jewish. And she was she is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And she always sort of put this bug in my ear, you got to find out about your family. And luckily she is a beautiful writer. She's a very talented writer. So as I started sharing things with her, I think she was the one who said, you need to turn it into a book.
Mm.
Now, what was the other thing that was important to me is it was by writing it, it made my ancestors feel alive, and I wanted to be connected to them. So the other thing that was very important for me was I have a lot of pictures in the book because I wanted these people to be alive. And I think the pictures, along with the stories, helped bring them to life. So that was important to me, and I don't remember what else I was going to say.
That's okay. When you mentioned it to your older brothers, you obviously waited a period of time because of your dad. Was the reaction from your older brothers the same as your older sister, or was it a surprising reaction?
Well, when I first sent them the books, and when the book came out, I sent my family sort of the pre-copies, if you will, and they all said, "Wow, the research is fantastic. The stories are great." And their comment was, "But I don't think anyone's going to be interested in these except for the family." Which has not been the case. I've had so many people really love the stories, and I've gotten a lot of very positive feedback and comments. So, and the other thing that has been sort of fun is I've, a lot of Pulitzers have reached out to me and we're sort of exploring whether we're related. So it's been
Now,
exciting.
you said Pulitzer, and earlier I said Pulitzer, and you said Pulitzer was okay. So are you using it either way?
Yes, yeah, it's the difference is POL instead of PUL. But I will say that most of the Pulitzers are from the town of Pulitz back in the 1700s. That's how they got their name. And so there's a lot of people, Pulitzers, and it could be spelled with an O, it could be
Mhm.
spelled with a U, it could be spelled with two L's. There were so many different spellings. But most likely we're related. So
So it's okay if I say Pulitzer versus Pulitzer.
yeah, yeah,
Okay, that's good. I don't want to be
yeah.
incorrect. What you mentioned the reaction of your family, particularly the brothers, and that they felt that it wouldn't necessarily make a good book. But beyond that, what was their reaction? I mean, clearly you and maybe a few other siblings have an emotional connection to your family going back 8 generations. Some other members of your family may not really see it the same way or feel it the same way. So is that what you're getting within your, I don't want you to embarrass any family members, but are you getting a mix of reaction to that? Well, it's nice that you did this, Linda, but it doesn't have any effect on our lives. Whereas others said,
Yeah,
oh, okay, I get the
I
connection.
think, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, that's right.
I think what's happened is through the writing of the book, it helped me sort of process this. And as we, as I said, feel a very deep connection to them. To my ancestors. I think they didn't have that opportunity. And I think in a sense, they're still processing it.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Is there still, are you prepared to accept that there's still information out there that you have not collected yet after writing the book?
I'm sure there's a lot of information. The question is, without an incredible sleuth like Andras, it's difficult. But that's where, with other Pulitzers reaching out to me and exploring if we're related, there are things that I'm learning. So it's fun. Yeah.
Your mother, who was Catholic, was an honoree in Israel. Could you explain a little bit about that and how it sort of ties into the larger story?
Sure. My mother, and I'll give you a little bit of background. When I was in 1990, I traveled to Budapest with my parents, and my father was working pretty much the whole time. So I got to spend a lot of time with my mom. And at that point, I had found out that my father was Jewish. Um, so I asked her, I just peppered her with a lot of questions. And she told me some truths, not all the truth, not, she was still protecting my father, that was clear. But she sort of, I'll never forget this. It was one conversation and we were talking about my great grandmother. And at one point she just sort of said casually, very casually, I hid some people. And I didn't have enough history to
Hmm.
really explore what that meant. So in 2006, we got an invitation from the Israeli consulate saying, please come to this award ceremony for your mother. She's being honored as righteous among the nations. Now, righteous among the nations is the highest award that the Israeli government gives to non-Jews who hid Jews during the Holocaust and really risked their lives to hide Jews during the Holocaust. It's a very well researched. They don't give this award lightly. When they give the award, then her name is permanently in the Garden of Honor at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And so her name is there along with such names as, most people know Oskar Schindler and Roel Wallenberg and names like that. So she's up there on the wall with them.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, in 2006, when the award was given to her, she had already been suffering from Alzheimer's. So I'm not sure she really understood what was going on. My father had to give her acceptance speech. But I will never forget this. After the ceremony, there were a lot of reporters hovering around, and one reporter asked her, how did you have the courage to do this? And she answered clearly, and that was remarkable in and of itself. She answered, I did what any decent human being would do. And that was my mother in her humbleness and humility. She was a remarkable person.
That says it all. So
yeah.
When you were researching and you found all this information, in the Jewish religion, generally speaking, if the mother is Jewish, then the kids are Jewish. But if the mother is not Jewish, then the kids are not Jewish, even if the father is Jewish. In this case, the father thought he was Catholic, and now it turns out he's Jewish. But in the long term, it still gets a little muddy and complicated. So how do you consider yourself as a result of the fact that your father now you find out is Jewish, but your mother still isn't Jewish? So do you see yourself as Jewish, or do you see yourself as a mix, as some people do?
What a great question. It's interesting. Obviously, when the Nazis came in, it didn't matter if your father or mother, if you had a grandparent who was Jewish, you were Jewish. We were raised Catholic, but I'll be honest with you, religion has never played that big a part in my life. I'm very spiritual. I believe in God, but religion has not played that big a piece in my life. But I will say, having researched this and understanding these stories, I can't tell you how proud I am of my ancestors. I mean, they believed in the values and Jewish values, and they lived them. And for example, my great grandfather, Ignaz Misner, he had requested, it's a long story, but at one point he had written to Governor Horthy requesting exemption from all the very restrictive Jewish restrictions, the anti-Jewish laws. And Governor Horthy actually wrote him back, and he got the exemption, but he refused to take off the yellow star. And he said, I wear my Judaism with pride. And, that to me says it all. I can't be more proud of my ancestors. So my Jewish ancestors.
Getting back to your mother for a second, there was also a mural that was painted for her in, I believe, in Buffalo.
Yes.
New York. And how did that come about?
So there's something called the Global Mural Project, and it's sponsored by the Artists for Israel and an organization to fight anti-Semitism. So they have, I think there's 6 or 7 murals throughout the world. And what they realized that in Buffalo, there are 3 Hungarians who were all honored as righteous among the nations and made their home in Buffalo. So it just made sense to have this mural in Buffalo, and it's at Russell Park. It was just unveiled in May 5th. Mm-hmm. They had a ceremony to unveil it. And nice. Very moving ceremony. It's beautiful.
There's also in Budapest, there's a permanent exhibition in addition to that mural in Buffalo. Tell us a little bit about that as well.
So when Andras was doing all of his research, I think I'd mentioned this, he was spending a lot of time with a Hungarian at the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives, mm-hmm. searching for information. And at the time, they had gotten a lot of money to renovate the Rambach Synagogue, which had basically not been renovated since World War II. It was largely destroyed in World War II. It's a beautiful synagogue. And they decided that they wanted to have a permanent exhibit that would help inspire others to find their roots. Because after the war, Hungary was taken over by the communists, and the communists were just as anti-Semitic as the Nazis were. And so most Jews, those who survived, and there weren't that many who survived, but those who survived, they did not practice their religion for the most part because of the communist rule. So now there's this movement to try to inspire others to find their roots. And so they decided to have this exhibit. It's a permanent exhibit at the Rambach Synagogue. And it's comprised of 10 8-minute films, and all the films are basically based on the stories in the book.
Oh, so you've been, I assume you've been to the synagogue.
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
So
good.
we had a big ceremony, and yeah, it was beautiful.
Before I let you go, what is the most important thing you want people to learn or to think about after reading your book? Again, it's called the Politzer Saga. See that?
Politzer Saga.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Politzer
yeah.
Saga.
The Politzer Saga. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think there's 2 points. One is these stories, I think, bring out how the destructive factor of hate and dehumanization. And we're all just people. We're really truly all one. My mother brought us up, and she would always say, it doesn't matter what your religion is, what your ethnicity, your economic status, the color of your skin, nothing that matters. All people needed to be treated with respect and dignity and compassion. And I think when you read these stories and you read about these remarkable people, I think that's what comes out. That's the message that I would like to convey. And I think there's a secondary message, and the secondary message is it's really important to understand history and to understand your own personal history. Without that, it's hard to move forward without that and to really understand yourself. And so I'd encourage people to find their history and to ask questions. I mean, I wish I had asked questions, and there was this impenetrable web of secrecy, but I wish I had pushed through it earlier and gotten these stories from my parents and from my grandmother.
Well, hopefully people reading your book will get those 2 messages and act on them. That's a great way to leave it. My guest has been Linda Ambrus Broenniman. She's author of the Politzer Saga, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual places. And for everything about Linda, you can go to Politzer.com. And Linda, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And join us every Thursday for a new schmear on Ira's Everything Bagel.